how can the theist respond to the Euthyphro Dilemma? So let's review real quick. The Euthyphro Dilemma was a problem for theism. So Christian theism, Jewish theism, Islamic theism are all going to be subject to this sort of objection, at least initially. So we saw how the Euthyphro Dilemma posed this problem for theists. Either morality precedes God or God precedes morality in the ontological sense. If God's responses and his judgments about what's morally right and wrong, good and bad, etc., are just responses to pre-existent moral facts, it looks like the problem is morality is going to be independent of God, metaphysically antecedent to God, if you want to get fancy. And the problem there is that all those forms of theism, whether Jewish, Christian, Islamic, are all committed to the sovereignty of God, in the sense that nothing is independent of God, right? Whether it's God's creation, which is causally dependent on God, or mathematics, or morality, or whatever, everything, according to traditional theism, needs to be explained in some sense by God for him to maintain his sovereignty. So, morality being independent of God is not going to work on theism. That would be a big problem. On the other hand, you might say that God's response or God's judgments about morality actually determine the moral facts. Right? God's declaring it wrong or thinking it wrong or having some other attitude towards it makes it wrong. And similarly for other sorts of moral properties like goodness or badness or virtue advice. But it looks like on that view, morality comes out to be arbitrary because it seems like God could have commanded anything, or he could have had any opinions or attitudes towards our actions, right? So it could have been that genocide was morally permissible. What was keeping God from thinking that if it wasn't the moral facts? And it couldn't have been the moral facts, because again, God's response is antecedent to morality. If his response brings morality into existence, it couldn't be because it's wrong that God thinks that it's wrong. So what's keeping him from thinking that genocide is permissible? And thus bringing that fact about. Okay, so morality looks arbitrary on what I'm calling option 2. And according to the Euthyphro Dilemma, these are the only two options. Okay, so two bad responses you could make to the Euthyphro Dilemma is just to double down on one of these two options, I think. You could just double down and say morality precedes God. God's thinking something wrong is just a response to the independent fact that it is wrong. But like we just explained, this is going to be a bad reply, at least for a theist, because theism is committed to the sovereignty of God. You could just say, yeah, there was some stuff in the beginning with God, right? You could say, look, before God engaged in any creative act, there was God and there was morality as this separate thing. But that is antithetical to theism. So you can't do that. That's a bad response. You don't want to give up your theism to save your theism. It would also be a bad response, I think, to double down on option 2 and just admit that morality is arbitrary. This would undermine so much of our moral conviction, our everyday moral conviction. Because we don't want to say that it easily could have been that genocide is permissible or even laudatory. Right? That just doesn't seem right. If our theism requires us to say that, yeah, genocide is wrong, but it easily could have been not only okay, but a great thing, that seems like a horrible consequence. It maybe is not quite as undermining to theism as this response, which seems to, require you to give up theism in order to maintain theism, but it's still really, really bad. Right? It would still be sort of a reductio, because it entails this totally absurd claim. Okay, so I want to talk about a third sort of response. And in one sense, it's to say that these are not the only two options. In another sense, it's to say that we haven't gotten fine-grained enough in talking about morality, and we can still work with these two options and come up with a better response. So the better response hinges on this distinction. There are many different kinds of moral properties. So on the Euthyphro Dilemma, as I just presented it, morality is presented as this sort of monolithic thing, right? It's just morality, and it's either morality is dependent on God, or God is dependent on morality in some sense. But as it turns out, there's so much more structure and variety to the moral universe than just that, right? We can differentiate, just to make one quick little differentiation, between good and bad. So the property of goodness is obviously different from the property of rightness or obligatoriness. These are all different from the property of permissibility, all different from the property of virtue. And of course, each of those positive properties has a negative counterpart: good and bad, right and wrong, virtue and vice, permissible, impermissible. Okay, so now there's big questions in ethics about whether you can talk about the relationships between those properties in any meaningful way, whether rightness and somehow reduces to goodness or virtue somehow depends on goodness, etc. But we don't need to get into that right now. What's important is that these are distinct properties. They're distinct moral properties. And once you see that, you can see that we could actually talk about God's relationship to each property on its own. And it might be that God's relationship to goodness is different than his relationship to rightness and wrongness. And that's all different from his relationship to virtue and vice. Once you recognize this, here's how the response goes. It actually could be true that God's thinking something wrong makes it wrong. So we're actually going to focus here on option 2. Now, so far we've just given option 2 as the proponent of the Euthyphro Dilemma gives it. God's thinking something wrong, or judging it wrong, or disapproving of it, or whatever his response or his attitude is, actually makes it wrong. So then we can ask, but how do we get out of this arbitrariness objection? Well, here's how. If all we're talking about is wrongness so far, none of this entails or even implies that God's response or his attitudes are what bring about facts about goodness, for example, or virtue and vice, for example. So just saying that God's attitudes bring about the facts about wrongness doesn't commit us either way on any of the other moral properties. And so when we ask, well, okay, what keeps the facts about wrongness from being arbitrary, then the theist is still free to say, well, it's the facts about goodness. It wouldn't be good for God to command or opine or believe or whatever that genocide is acceptable. That's not a good thing to do, right? And so God wouldn't do that. So morality is not arbitrary. God could not have brought it about that genocide is acceptable or much less good or laudatory, because that's not a good thing to do. It's not good to bring about that moral fact. It wouldn't be good for God to do that. Okay? Now, so what this amounts to is that we have moral constraints on what God can command. And that makes it non-arbitrary that the wrongness facts and the rightness facts are what they are. They really couldn't have been much different. Maybe they could have been a little different, but they couldn't have been much different, because we have these goodness facts constraining what God can command or bring about by his attitudes. Now, you might be thinking, this just pushes this problem back a step, right? Because now we have to ask, what about the goodness facts? Where do those come from? Right? Are those going to be independent of God? Or do we have another God's response bringing those about? And now if we have another of God's responses or attitudes bringing about the goodness facts, don't we face the arbitrariness objection just again? Because God could have brought about different goodness facts, which would have put different constraints on his responses to wrongness. And this could have meant that God's wrongness commands, or his commands that bring about wrongness, could have been very different, and thus we get the arbitrariness problem again. Well, the answer here introduces a little nuance. The claim is, or the way this argument is usually made, is not that God's attitudes bring about the goodness facts. So it's a very different sort of explanation than for God's relationship to rightness and wrongness. The idea is actually that God himself is somehow essentially good. So with regard to goodness, God's responses and his attitudes don't bring it about. So we avoid the problems with option 2. Goodness is not arbitrary. God's commands don't bring goodness about, or facts about goodness. But we're also going to be able to avoid the problems with option 1. Because while goodness acts as a constraint on what God can or cannot command, goodness is actually deeply a part of God's nature. It's part of who God is, that he's good, and it's part of what goodness is, on the other hand, that it's defined, in some sense, by God's nature. So we are saying that goodness is necessary in a way that wrongness is not, right? Goodness is not brought about by God's commands or his attitudes in any way, but it's deeply a part of his nature. So it's not the case that it's independent of him. It's part of who God is, and it's part of what goodness is, that is defined by God's nature. So that's a way that you can get out, if you're a theist, of the Euthyphro Dilemma without committing to either of these problems that its proponents say you're going to run into. You divide and conquer by talking about different moral properties. Rightness and wrongness, maybe other moral properties, can be brought about by God's attitudes, as long as there are other sorts of moral properties that constrain what God can command or the attitudes he can take that bring about those sorts of moral properties. And if those other moral properties are not independent of God, they're somehow bound to his character or his nature, but it's not an independent constraint on God's nature. Morality, or at least these sorts of moral properties, are not the sort of things that are not explained by God, right? They are part of God.